for The Guardian. Mike Katz, chair of the Jewish Labour Movement, and Andrew Leadsom, Conservative MP for South Northamptonshire and a former Cabinet Minister. They're here to take your calls. The number to call 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850, or if you have Alexa, say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And of course, you can watch us on Global Player. Lots to talk about tonight. Tonight's breaking news that the lawyer representing the young person involved in the BBC presenter scandal saying their own mother's claims in The Sun are rubbish. The Bank of England governor's big speech tonight, in which he'll say how important it is to cut inflation. No kidding. Unite votes to maintain its ties to Labour, but warns it'll have maximum leverage over a Labour government. And President Biden saying the special relationship, God how I hate that phrase, remains rock solid during his brief visit to the UK today. So lots and lots to talk about. 0345 6060 973.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, welcome to you all. Let's get cracking with our first question. It's from Rupert in Lancaster. Hi, Rupert.
Hello, Ian panel. Are we stooping down to Russia's level with cluster bombs?
America is going to supply the Ukrainians with cluster bombs. We're not. Polly Toynbee.
Well, we don't support cluster bombs. We never have in this country, neither the government nor the opposition, and I think we should stick to that. I hope that perhaps they won't actually be used, that even if the Ukrainians have it, they might reckon that if they're going to win this war, they don't want their own territory covered in these lethal weapons that will kill their own children. The Russians are using them already, aren't they? Well, I know that may be so, but we don't all want to do what the Russians do. I hope they don't actually get used.
What about the argument is that all's fair in love and war, fight fire with fire?
Well, that's also true, but and the Russians seem to have very little. Actually, they have some restraint. There are those who say they could be doing even worse.
Well, they're not using nuclear weapons. I suppose that's a form of restraint.
That's something that is a form of restraint. I just think that if we have signed agreements and treaties that we are against cluster bombs, we should try and stick to our own principles, much as we need the Ukrainians to win.
And obviously we don't know what Rishi Sunak said to President Biden today, but would you have expected him to sort of issue a mild rebuke?
I would expect him to raise it with a kind of whisper so that he could say he raised it, the way people do with embarrassing.
Yes, we're going to raise human rights with the Chinese. And
exactly.
You say, we're going to raise this. I've raised it. Thank you very much. Alan Mendoza.
Well, I'll take a slightly different position here. Obviously, our position is that we won't use cluster bombs, we won't supply them ourselves, but the Americans are not sort of tied into the same treaties as we are. If they wish to do so, I don't see any reason why we're going to sort of admonish them for doing it, because principally I spent the whole day speaking to Ukrainians about this issue. I didn't meet one Ukrainian who thought that the future prospect, if you like, of clearing up whatever might be left over from this cluster bomb, munitions is worth bearing in mind when the Russians are currently killing, maiming, raping, sort of going across the land, destroying it. As far as they're concerned, they want their land back. They'll worry about the clean-up, the reconstruction afterwards. This has been brought on them by Russia. All they want is to defend it. And it's a very limited munitions approach. They're not going to be using it in urban areas. It's going to be just to dig them out of trenches, basically. Somehow they've got to dig them out of trenches, Ian. You've got to give them something to do that.
Andrew Leadsom, you sat around the cabinet table. If this came up in a cabinet meeting that you were at, what would you be advising the Prime Minister to do?
Well, I think exactly as he did do, which is to say that we don't support the use of cluster bombs. The UK would not be providing them and don't have them. However, I do think there's another angle here, which is I understand that the Russian cluster bomb equivalent is very unreliable, so a lot of them don't explode. So you've got that massive danger. Also, the land that Russia have overrun is very heavily mined. So arguably, the use of cluster bombs on the Ukrainian side across those areas will explode those mines and those other cluster bombs. And so in a way, it is potentially a form of mine clearance. I mean, it is a terrible, terrible situation. And I was talking to somebody today who's just been recently out to the front line and seen the devastation. And it is appalling. You know, this war has to end. And so I think it's entirely understandable that the Ukrainians will do whatever it takes.
Mike Katz.
Well, I think there could be a course of agreement around the table. Listen, I don't think either Ukraine or the US would have taken this decision lightly. We are signatories to the convention. Neither of those two countries are, and so they are free to deploy them in the way that they see fit. And Andrew's raised a very interesting point about whether actually the reliability of some more efficient cluster munitions could actually be doing good rather than more harm. It's a terrible situation. We have to stand absolutely steadfast with both Ukraine and indeed the USA and the rest of our NATO allies, and have some trust that the decision taken was for the right reasons, with the right levels of intelligence about how they'll be deployed.
But, I mean, the US is obviously the leading player in NATO. We are, I would have probably said, the second leading player. We are disagreeing with our main ally in this. Is that a healthy place to be? Doesn't that even give succor to the Russians?
Well, I think our position is a little bit more nuanced than that, isn't it? It's the fact is we've signed up to a global convention that doesn't allow us to deploy them. Neither Ukraine or US have taken that decision yet. That leaves them some freedom to move. So, in a sense of whether NATO partners are disagreeing, I don't think that's actually the case. We need to work carefully with the US, and I'm sure as both Polly and Andrea mentioned, there would have been some discreet discussion about this when the Prime Minister met the President. But at the same time, I think it's clear that we need to, that if they're going to proceed, we'd rather have US engaged and, on the front foot when it comes to Ukraine, rather than holding back, as so often they do, for domestic policy reasons.
Well, it's a difficult subject, but Rupert, you've heard what our panel have to say. Any comeback from you?
I think whatever it takes on the battlefield should be used. So I would cautiously and with a heavy heart use these weapons to clear the trenches.
OK. All right, Rupert, thank you very much for that. Let's move on to another subject, much in the news. Robbie is in Chelmsford. Hi, Robbie.
Hiya, my question is the UK news media sufficiently regulated?
I can't imagine what you're referring to on this. Well, I can, and which is why I should say from the outset that obviously there are regulations, there are laws about what media organisations can report on the issue that you're referring to here. And we should also report the breaking news tonight that the lawyer representing the young person involved in this story surrounding a BBC presenter says the claims made by that young person's mother are rubbish, and that the Sun were told this before publishing their original story on Friday night. The Sun says it's reporting a story about concerned parents and has seen evidence to back up its claims. Andrea, let's start with you.
Yes, well,
you're thinking, please don't come to me first.
Yeah, I really am. I mean, and I'm sure you'll hear it from all of us, we are all absolute supporters of the free press. Anyone disagree with that? I don't think we would. So, I mean, the press do a huge amount of good in uncovering stories and systemic abuse and so on and so on. So there's no doubt that freedom of the press is essential. But as you've just explained yourself, Iain, the Sun knew the facts, decided to publish the story anyway, then got challenged. So now they're saying that, it was because it was concerned parents. Well, that wasn't how it sounded on Friday night, was it? So, this is the problem. There is a tendency to make a story, and having been at the butt end of that so many times myself, I'm not entirely in favour of some of the tactics of the press, shall we say, whilst at the same time I do believe free press is an essential part of our democracy.
Andrea, can I ask you, at the time when the Leveson report came out and David Cameron passed the legislation for the Leveson, you presumably voted for that?
Absolutely, yes.
And so do you think it should be carried out in full? I mean, we don't have an independent regulator, which is what, that Cameron wanted, what Leveson wanted.
Yeah.
And then, due to intimidation by the press, Cameron backed off and everybody got frit. Politicians are always intimidated by the mighty power of about 3 press barons, and it's gone away again. And we know we do not have that independent regulator that was promised.
It's a difficult one, Polly. At the time, I was absolutely astonished that we didn't go ahead with the full implementation. And to this day, I don't know if you're right, if it was intimidation, but it seemed that people were queuing up to say not necessary, not necessary. It certainly seems to me that that the press don't always get it right. And certainly that we've all seen reputations trashed, we've seen people brought low, we've seen people seriously harmed emotionally as well as physically by things that have come out in the press that were not justifiable. So I think there are major problems. The other thing I've always thought is that, if you put on your front page that, Andrea Leadsam's done this, and it turns out that she didn't, rather than sort of publish the retraction on page 18 in sort of size 0.05 font, you should plaster it all over the front page again.
There are rules about that.
There are some rules, yes, but
they're only by
rules.
IPSO, and they, who was written by newspaper editors such as Paul Dacre has actually written the code. Well, what kind of independence is that?
Yeah, but we've seen a lot of
Mendoza.
we've seen a lot of stories, kind of been countermanded over the years. People have to apologise, etc. You've seen, and there have been legal challenges as well. Of course, people are entitled to go to the courts to enforce their way. I don't actually think the problem is press regulation right now. I think there are enough sort of ways that you can hold the media to account. I've got a bigger problem, which is if you compare the regulation as imperfect as it is for the press, look at the Wild West on social media, where literally anything can go.
Yeah.
Just in a rather jokey way, I saw Ian that someone was joking that you might have been the person. Obviously, it was a joke.
Thanks for that, Alan.
No, you're not the person, obviously. But the point is,
I did point out
exactly.
Did you miss the phrase BBC presenter?
But the very fact that someone says that, tells you that this is the real unregulated space, and we know that those companies, the social media giants, have tried desperately for the online safety bill, which you're no doubt scrutinising at the moment, to try and avoid further scrutiny there.
Well, of course they should come under it as well. Of course they should. Of course the social media should be subject to exactly the same rules as everybody else.
How can it be? That's the problem, because we've had all sorts of speculation over the weekend about who this person is. I suspect that every one of us in the studio knows who the alleged presenter is, but we can't say it because it would be libelous if we did, and nor should we in many ways. But of course, I felt so sorry for Ryland Clark over the weekend, where The Independent had got this lurid headline about a BBC presenter, and then his big picture underneath. Now, there was a caption making clear that he had responded to sort of social media stuff. But to all intents and purposes, anybody glancing at it would have thought he was the BBC presenter.
Yeah.
Now, he took it relatively calmly. I'm not sure I would have done.
So if print media are meant to, set the tone and be a standard to which, social media maybe should aspire, then that means surely some stronger levels of regulation. Because as Polly pointed out, it's basically you've got the poacher writing the gamekeeper's transfer at the moment. It's absolutely ridiculous, and we know that there are other areas of public life, other regulated utilities that are coming under some fair criticism at the moment. That you've got people who are former regulators leaving that job and then going over to the regulated industry to earn a quick buck. And people say, well, is this fair? Is this right? And there are rules around that, and there's no framework. I think that, as Polly said, I think Andrew is agreeing, that Part 2 of Leveson should be enacted, because I think we've actually had a trial period of IPSO. It's proven wanting, and so that means there should be some beefier regulation. Because I think if we're going to regulate social media, that will take a while to come. But I think it's up for if legacy media, as we're going against print media, wants to have a reputation worth saving, then it has to hold itself to higher standards. It's tricky, it's not nice, but it has to do. It's maybe not fair, rather, but it has to do it.
You're quite right about this business of an open door between regulator and regulated. Just think, Boris Johnson tried to put Paul Dacre in to be head of Ofcom to regulate the media. What kind of insanity is this? And so that's why we need a genuinely independent regulator.
It just doesn't pass the sniff test, basically.
Maybe not, but this phrase, in genuinely independent, I'm not sure such a person exists, because you could grab someone off the street and put them in as the regulator, and because they wouldn't have any sort of beef in the game. But surely you need to have somebody who's been inside the industry and knows what can go on and knows all the sort of nooks and crannies to look into. And that person can never be genuinely
No,
independent.
it needs to be a panel of people, of experts and people who probably have come from the industry, politically balanced across different types of media. It's not just one.
Maybe you and I could have a job share.
Oh, certainly. I'm happy to do it.
And you'd never get anywhere running anything by a committee. Therein lies the road to ruin.
But I think you've just described most regulators of other utilities. Yes, there's a mixture of people who are experienced in the sector and some outside expertise as well, some independence that you come. I mean, otherwise we just say it's too difficult to regulate anything, and we'll just let it be a Wild West in all spheres of economic activity. And I don't think the public want that, really.
But I've got to make one point. Even with all these regulators, that won't stop the media making mistakes. It won't do it. You're not going to have any regulator that can step in before a story is said. So your question is always what happens afterwards, and maybe there needs to be beefing up there.
But on this one, if you are told by the alleged victim that this is not true, and you go ahead and publish,
exactly,
and let's assume, for argument's sake, that it absolutely is not true, and the alleged victim, is right. How is the Sun going to be sanctioned on this?
And that is exactly the issue. It's a perfect example because, of course, everyone will just head for the hills. You know, who wants this story to keep going? And what we absolutely know is that if people start fighting back, saying, oh, well, I said was, no, but what I said was, all it does is sells more papers. It covers everybody with excrement. It does not make anyone look good. It keeps the story going. It makes people more and more miserable. I mean, I think the first thing I ever learnt, the first time I became a minister, was don't add fuel to the fire. Yeah. They're accusing you left, right and centre. If you try and fight back and say that is not true, you're just going to make it worse. And that can't be right.
I can see it now, Rupert Murdoch saying, this is the humblest day of my life, as he did with the hacking scandal. And then somehow or another, you know, one newspaper morphed into another and things went on just as before.
I don't think
well, News of the World did actually close down.
Yes, but then the Sun on Sunday cropped up instead.
Yeah, it's a pale imitator. I miss the News of the World. I'm going to say it, but there we are.
I liked its slogan, all human life is here.
Someone on a text saying, Polly Toynbee has it in for Paul Dacre this evening. I think, to be fair, it's not just this evening.
No, it's always.
Yeah, exactly. Right, we'll move on in just a few moments.
I'm sure he speaks highly of you, Polly.
He certainly has written some stuff.
0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. You are listening to, or hopefully watching, Cross Question on LBC and Global Player. It's 8:20.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
If you've just tuned in, let me tell you who's on our cross-question panel tonight. We have Andrea Leadsom, Conservative MP, former Cabinet Minister, Mike Katz is Chair of the Jewish Labour Movement, Polly Toynbee, columnist for The Guardian, and Dr Alan Mendoza from the Henry Jackson Society. Remind us what the Henry Jackson Society is.
Well, it's a think tank promoting and preserving the principles of free and democratic societies.
Excellent. Right, let's... I don't need to ask you what the Jewish Labour Movement is, Mike, do I? Because we kind of... It says... It's a Ron Seal title, isn't it? It says
that's what it says on the tin.
Exactly. Right, let's move on to our next question. It's from Robert in Shrewsbury. Hello, Robert. No, it's a text question. Does the prospect of a massive union controlling a Labour government chill you? Unite's General Secretary Sharon Graham says it will have maximum leverage over a Labour government after Unite members strongly voted against disaffiliating from the party during its conference. Mike Katz.
Well then, I'm very glad that they voted against disaffiliation. That's a good sign, because I think in other times there might and other unions have considered this question. It has been a less clear vote. As somebody else who runs a socialist society, not a trade union, but we're both affiliated to the Labour Party in the same way, I think I understand my job's to represent my members with when I'm talking to the Labour Party and the Labour leadership. But at the same time, I don't think how am I going to control the whole of an incoming Labour government. And Sharon Graham, as the General Secretary of Unite, I think has made it really clear that she's very interested in her absolute number one priority from morning to evening is representing her workers and following an industrial agenda. And that's absolutely fine. I think some of the political points people make around the direction of the Labour Party, and that's sort of interpreted as and I've read it all day in terms of the way this has been reported, as a criticism that people aren't happy with the way that the Labour Party is going in terms of candidate selection. And firstly, it's very, I think, to allege that some of the issues that people are not getting selected for has anything to do with, the future of school assistants or the steel industry or public sector workers or bus drivers or indeed all the many hundreds of thousands, millions of members that Sharon Graham represents is really for the birds.
No, the way she's worded what she said today, it will add fuel to the fire in Conservative campaign headquarters, because they can use these words against the Labour Party. Basically, she's saying, well, if you don't do what we want, we're not going to give you £3 million. That's the subtext.
Well, the single biggest organisation, shock factor, the single biggest organisation that funds, corporate entity that funds the Labour Party in general terms is the Association of Labour Councillors, because they take a levy from every Labour councillor and they give it back to the party. And I don't think when people are saying, oh, what happens if Labour councillors try and dictate Labour Party policy, people wouldn't say that's a strange thing. Trade unions, social societies like mine, are part of fabric of the Labour Party, of the Labour movement, and they have a space around the table to argue their case on behalf of the members, but it's no more than a space. And the idea that and to be honest, as a Unison member with more members than Unite have, I'd be rather miffed the idea that Unite has suddenly decided it's going to be controlling the Labour Party, and that's that. There are a number of trade unions affiliated to the Labour Party. They all have members with different priorities and opinions, and they will try and influence the development of policy in those directions. There'll be lots of Labour MPs, lots of Labour councillors who will try and influence the Labour Party in that direction. The point of the Labour leadership and the way the Labour Party works is to balance it out and always bear in mind the most important thing is what our voters want. And nobody, and I think least of all Keir Starmer, is going to privilege the voice of Sharon Graham above any of the voters that he is trying to get to support him to become the next Prime Minister.
Andrew Leadsom.
Well, I want to start by saying that when I was business secretary, I had a very good relationship with Unite over saving British steel, and they were very good to deal with there. But yes, I do have some grave concerns about overbearing union power against a Labour government. I mean, we've got this huge problem at the moment where the Labour shadow front bench won't come out and criticise the strikes that are really causing harm to people right across the country who've got their procedures and operations being delayed and cancelled. People can't get to work because of train drivers' strikes. And now Labour are still not even saying consultants, most of whom earn considerably more than the Prime Minister, shouldn't go on strike.
Strikes in the health sector,
well, no, Wes Streeting has said he thinks junior doctors asking for £35,000 is too much. He hasn't said
35% pay rise.
35% pay rise, beg your pardon. What he hasn't said is that the strikes shouldn't go ahead, or that it's completely wrong, or that they need to get real. He hasn't said what would be a reasonable settlement. So I actually think, Labour needs to take a grown-up view of what's going on and actually stand up for the people of this country.
Well, Wes Streeting has written an extremely good book, which he's coming on to talk about on Thursday, but she's even had criticism from people for that, I think, which I think is a little bizarre. And tomorrow night on LBC at 7, we've got the 2 remaining Conservative candidates for London Mayor coming into the studio, which I'm slightly looking forward to. If I'm honest, I'm not sure either of them are up to it, but do you know either of them, Andrew?
Not very well, but no, I think they're both very good contenders. I certainly don't think that Sadiq Khan is unassailable. I think his policies on ULEZ are quite problematic.
Later, you never know.
Yeah.
Right, back to the prospect of unions controlling a Labour government. That's a question from Robert in Shrewsbury. Polly.
Well, I think Sharon Graham is a very good leader. She's definitely not a Len McCluskey, who was absolutely, best friends with Jeremy Corbyn. It's quite a different world in the unions, and the unions are pretty united with Labour and pretty united in the endeavour to get Labour elected. I mean, there are a handful of Corbynista people in Unite who put forward this motion, and I think it was a great relief to everybody. It was overwhelmingly voted against. The great majority of Unite members want to support Labour, back Keir Starmer, get a Labour government, and Sharon Graham's very much, she's very practical, because she really is interested not in playing politics, but in the policies, and particularly the industrial policies. And the sort of industrial policies that Labour's been putting forward have been like fair pay agreements in every sector, would be transformative in terms of low pay, because after all, most people don't belong to a union, right across the country.
Well, we should also point out that more than 30% of Unite members are Conservative voters.
I'm sure they are, but then large numbers of Unite members, like all unions, don't actually vote even for their own union leadership. It's a very peculiar business who votes and doesn't vote. I mean, it's always been true that large numbers of people in manual jobs have voted Conservative, or we would never have had a Conservative government. And those are the people Labour has to set out to persuade. And I think Sharon Graham is absolutely on the right side on this. As for financing parties, well, personally, I would do away with it altogether. I would have no private donors. I mean, apart from membership fees, I'd have no private donors. I wouldn't have these multi-billionaires paying shed loads into the Tories, and occasionally a bit to Labour, and the unions paying to Labour. It's not a good idea.
Well, I'm not so sure that you can just wish this away. I mean, you've done a good job, Mike, of wishing it away and saying, well, I'm like the unions, we do the same thing, and Polly's saying, yes, of course, they want a Labour government. Come on, the mask has slipped here. The reality is, she said what she means, which is, I'm going to try and control the next Labour government. Now, that's, fair enough.
Hasn't she just said, I'm going to try and influence the next Labour government? And there's nothing wrong with that.
Maximum leverage, Ian, what does that mean?
Well, it means influence, doesn't it?
No, it means I'm going to use... £3
million on the table.
It means whatever I can use to influence in this sort of way. It doesn't mean Len McCluskey, I agree with you there. But what it does mean is that, a small tail be wagging the larger dog. And I think it's interesting. The Labour Party have tried not to, kind of come onto a policy, say, on the pay review board. Oh, will we back it, won't we back it, we're not going to say, etc. They are going to head for a collision course quite clearly with some of the unions on this. And I think there's a clear warning from the unions to say, don't think we're just going to let you have your own way on this. We are going to make our presence felt. Now, whether you think that's good or bad, that's a reality of what trade unions do. That's what they're there to do. They're there to represent their members to the highest levels.
And they do that with government at the moment, don't they? And I don't see how, say, in the world of education, where you've got obviously a dispute in the moment, or indeed the world of health, there's absolutely kind of zero engagement between the secretaries of state, and they're simply, we're used to kind of having brinkmanship and last minute bargaining when a strike's going to happen the next day. We're used to that. That's kind of industrial temperament environment that I grew up with, and that's just not happening now because the government aren't engaging the trade unions. You can't wish them away either, and quite rightly, they're a fact of life, and you have to deal with them.
Andrea gave an example of where she did engage with trade unions. As
very
a cabinet
effectively,
minister.
absolutely. But very specifically, I mean, to Polly's point and yours, Mike, about the fact that you want fair pay, etc. With junior doctors demanding a 35% pay rise, the problem is the other side of the equation is we are trying at the moment to stop rampant inflation from becoming sticky, becoming a wage price spiral that is so difficult ever to stop. So you'd be giving with one hand and taking away with the other.
They've actually said they're not demanding 35%. They're saying their pay has fallen 35%.
No, they have. That is their demand.
Well, they did at one point in the beginning, but since then they've really backed off that. There is a deal to be struck.
What
here,
are they
but
demanding then, Polly?
Well, they want to sit down at the table and what's called negotiate, in which you don't have absolutes on either side, or you get nowhere. And what's happening now is that the government is not sitting down with any of these
because
strikers.
I think they've said they have to drop the 35% before they will sit down.
Well, I don't think that's the case. I really don't. I think they won't sit down with them until, it's hard to know why not, because
it's not hard to know why not. The reason is because it is not possible, it is not in the national interest to agree to huge pay rises, notwithstanding where inflation is, because what that will do is bake in inflation and we will all be the poorer. It bakes in price rises and wage rises, and you get that spiral that we saw under previous Labour governments who tried to cap things and let people keep up and so on. That can't happen. It's not in the national interest. So it's in all of our interest to stop inflation and bring it down, and that's where the government's priority is.
Right, let's move on in just a moment. Really interesting question coming up. But before that, let's get the news headlines at 8:33 with Charlotte Morgan.
Police say they're still trying to work out a motive after a teacher was stabbed at a school in Gloucestershire this morning. Officers are questioning a teenager on suspicion of attempted murder. A lawyer representing the person involved in allegations against a BBC presenter says the claims are rubbish. In a letter to the corporation, they say nothing inappropriate or unlawful took place. And Joe Biden has described the relationship between the UK and US as rock solid after a meeting with Rishi Sunak. The American president's now gone to Lithuania ahead of tomorrow's NATO summit. LBC weather, showers and possible thunderstorms moving across Northern Ireland and Scotland. Heavy rain affecting much of England and Wales overnight with a low of 11.
LBC Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:36, some really interesting breaking news. With NATO members meeting in Lithuania, the organisation's General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg says he's hosted a meeting between Turkey's President Erdogan and Sweden's Prime Minister Kristersson, and that Erdogan has now agreed to allow Sweden to join NATO, quotes, as soon as possible. Finland joined in early April, but Turkey had blocked Sweden from joining until now because Ankara claimed that Sweden was giving shelter to terrorists. Now, that is a major development, and we'll talk to somebody later in the programme about what that actually means in the long term for NATO. Now, with us in the studio to answer your questions on Cross Question, we have Dame Andrea Leadsom, Mike Katz, Polly Toynbee and Dr. Alan Mendoza. Let's go to our next caller. It's David in Enfield. Hello, David.
Good evening, everyone.
Hello, what would you like to ask?
Is it in England's national interest to have such key strategic sectors as energy, water, railways, airports, ferries, owned largely by rapacious, profit-maximising foreign investors?
Should say it's not just England, it's the United Kingdom. To start with. Well, it is.
Hello. Scotland owns its own water.
All right, take water out of it, but on all the other things, it applies to the United Kingdom. Alan Mendoza.
Well, I think this applies. It's an interesting question because it kind of goes. You're talking about investors, obviously, because of the utility companies, but I think you can also look at, kind of foreign nations as well in this. And I think we have been over the last 3 decades far too easy, as it were, with who owns sort of key bits of national infrastructure. And I'm concerned certainly about Chinese companies coming in and doing that. Obviously, I'm concerned if there are companies out there that are not being run properly, that provide public services. That's also an issue. But there are two different arguments here. One is obviously preventing certain people from owning bits, and I would certainly prevent Chinese companies from doing that, given their closeness to the Chinese state. Then there's a question of regulation. It comes back to our regulatory approach we were talking about earlier in terms of how is it that you can manage process. Obviously, I think most of us around this table are in favour of free enterprise, but free enterprise comes with responsibility and with regulation that's required as well. And if companies are failing in that, then there needs to be appropriate punishments.
Do you think privatisation has been given a bad name by weak regulators?
Yes, I think actually it's a really good point. I think certainly back in the day, I don't think Margaret Thatcher would have envisioned this to be the outcome 3 decades later. I think the whole point of the market has always been, yes, as a free market, but you also have to ensure that the Wild West of capitalism does not occur. And I don't think that's something that most people who backed privatisation would have wanted. Yes, they feel that the private sector can do things better than the state, and I think actually it can. If you look at the performance of companies over that period, the answer would be compared to previously, I think definite improvement. But can there still be improvements? Of course. And there has to be effective regulation across those sectors. But I still don't think there's a massive cry for nationalisation. I don't think people want to go back to Britain PLC owning the commanding heights of the economy. Those days are over. I think that people want better regulation.
I think one of the interesting points in this argument is that I think that David's right, that there is this idea that sort of foreign investors, bad, we mustn't have them investing in our infrastructure, but fail to understand that Britain invests huge amounts in other countries, in a company. I mean, I think we're the biggest foreign investor in the United States, but we never really talk about that. Polly?
Well, I think it's shown what a disaster most of these privatisations were. Not all. I don't think anybody would want to go back to on telecoms, for instance, because it's changed out of all recognition. But water and energy have been a calamity. And I think Alan Mendoza hasn't been reading the opinion polls. What's fascinating is that overwhelmingly people are in favour of nationalisation. I mean, whether it's the right answer, that's a different question, but they are. And so are a majority of Conservative voters. The sense of outrage, sewage in the water is going to help lose one hell of a lot of Tory seats in the next election. And the electricity situation is, we've bailed out Bulb, we're bailing out people, the same as we've bailed out the banks. I mean, I think renationalising is difficult, because if I were going to be the next Labour Chancellor, thank goodness I'm not, would I want to spend
I'm not saying a word.
A huge
have a chat with Unite, Polly. They may make you
a huge amount of money, buying back these companies before you do anything to improve anything else. But I think you just have the most rigorous regulation. You make virtually no dividends for a long time. Some of them will collapse, in which case just take them back, like the railways companies collapsing. As they collapse, take them back in, but don't spend a huge amount of money buying them back.
I think that's a really interesting point, because people who say, yes, let's renationalise X, Y or Z, they do it without thinking of the consequences, because you can't just renationalise and sequester a company. You do have to pay compensation to the shareholders.
Unless they collapse.
Indeed. But if you do sequester, let's say, for example, that the future Labour government, and I could envisage this happening if Jeremy Corbyn had been Prime Minister, if they did say, yeah, we're going to renationalise water, but we're not going to pay any compensation to the owners of the water companies, the British economy would end overnight, because nobody would nobody would invest in it. Mike?
Well, it's interesting, because I think the question was focused around foreign investment funds from foreign countries that we may not be that sympathetic with, and obviously one immediately thinks of China, and particularly the control it has of some of these social media platforms. And there's obviously a lot of controversy about Saudi Arabia and its involvement and control over lots of sporting activity. And that got me thinking, when in football you have a fit and proper persons test, and I wonder why we don't have
That's working so well, isn't
it? We could, again, we're having so many bites of the regulatory cherry tonight, it's delightful. But, why is it, it's a good principle, it needs to be applied properly. But actually, why isn't there a fit and proper country test to those that are investing from foreign sovereign wealth funds in our national assets? Because I think we have to be clear that whilst we have kind of clear security concerns over major bits of infrastructure, some of the platforms, some of the technology, some of the IT, it seems to kind of go completely, without question. It's absolutely not Wild West, but it's completely free for people to invest in. And you can think, well, actually, this is as much a bit of national infrastructure as say, bridges, roads, energy plants, that kind of thing.
Andrea?
Well, to start with, it's not true to say that it's the Wild West. Actually, in recent years, we've put in place more legislation to protect critical industries and also to enable the government, where necessary, to be able to take a sort of golden share in critical defence areas, critical intellectual property, weaponry, etc. So it's not true that it's the Wild West. But what your caller was asking about was regulated sectors. And I think there can be no doubt that the nationalised equivalents were not better. So the privatisation has been an improvement. But what we've seen over the last 15, 20 years is greed, incompetence and poor oversight by regulators. So that's what needs to change. I think the very idea of renationalising, for a start, that's to forget who are these amazing shareholders. They're us. They're our pensions. And that is, if you're sort of suggesting, Polly, that let's let them fail and then we can just take the companies back, well, that's your pension. It's everybody's pension that is then failing. So to wish ill on them is not the right way to go.
I think, to be fair, Polly wasn't wishing ill. She wasn't wishing ill on them.
They're kind of collapsing around us.
Well, no, I don't think they are, actually.
Well, look at Thames Water.
No, which is vast. The amount of money they want to prop them up is so huge.
It is, but they're going to their shareholders. The alternative is that they go to the taxpayer. So actually what we need to be doing is to be wishing them well and much tighter regulation, but supporting the company to stay afloat, much as we did with British Steel, because actually it is in nobody's interest to see massive companies failing and then the taxpayer having to pick up the tab, which, as you rightly say, Polly, we've already seen with energy companies. Now, that was a kind of black swan event. That was not foreseeable, that Putin would invade Ukraine and we'd see energy bills going through through the roof. But all of these things point to the need for very strong regulation. And yes, of course, care over who takes over these companies. Nobody's allowing Chinese businesses or Russian businesses to own critical UK infrastructure. That's just not true. But nevertheless, what we actually need to see is some corporate competence.
With the nuclear.
Corporate competence. No, actually, with the nuclear, that is not the case. All that the Chinese
Who's
nuclear company...
building Hinkley Point too?
Hinkley Point is being built by EDF, which is a French company. The only Chinese involvement was a financial contribution on which they would make a financial return. And I can tell you that because I was energy minister at the time. There was no way that the UK was going to allow Chinese technology or Chinese access to any of our nuclear power stations.
Well, all I'd say is, if we talk about, strong regulation, I can't help but think there's one very significant area the government's clearly failed. If you look at water and the fact that multiple water companies have been allowed to actually completely fail their obligations. When
That's not true, Mike.
Well,
no.
Okay.
The whole argument.
From a caller's perspective, Andrew, what they will see is that there is effluent bits, surging out onto our rivers, onto our beaches.
Why is that?
It's not controlled because, what is the point of having regulation if it isn't to stop this sort of basic failure of a company to invest enough money in its infrastructure?
Yeah, the fact of the matter is climate change, huge rainfall is overwhelming the sewers. The alternative to not allowing them to discharge into rivers and seas is it comes into your kitchen, your bathroom, your bedroom. It is a failure to invest over many years.
It's also... Yeah, because they haven't invested. I mean, where I live in the southeast water, there have been people who haven't been able to get any drinking water for like a week on end.
And I've had exactly the same in my constituency.
And the reason is, it's not because there's a lack of water, it's because they haven't invested in the pumping infrastructure.
And on that, I'm totally agreeing. I am totally agreeing. It's been subject to poor regulation.
They've paid out all these dividends over the years to their shareholders instead of fixing the pipes and fixing the pumps.
Ian, I don't
fix the pumps while the sun's shining.
I don't think it's unfair to be able to say, well, I want to have drinking water available to me. I want to be able to swim safely in the river or the sea that's close to me, and also I don't really want to have...
But that's where the regulation has failed.
Can anyone
one at a time, we'll get complaints.
Can anyone name a regulator that they actually approve of? Seriously, can anyone think?
I think Ofcom, wonderful.
Marvellous, Ian. Good.
And on that note, we'll move on. It's 8:48.
LBC
taxpayer.co.uk.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 8:51 on LBC. Ben is in Clacton and has a question for us. Hello, Ben.
Good evening, Ian, and good evening, panel, and welcome back, Ian.
Thank you.
I missed you.
Well, thank you very much. I've been back a week. Weren't you around last week, Ben?
No, I did try to ring in, but there was too many better questions than I had.
Ah, well, there you are. Now, what's your question now?
Isn't it about time that we funded political parties from the public purse to reduce the amount of influence that either the trade unions or big business have on decisions in government?
Well, it obviously refers back to a question that we had earlier on Unite. Polly?
Yes, I think absolutely.
Well, I think you actually already answered this.
I've already answered.
Didn't you?
I'll tell you what I would do, because it would mean the state funding parties according to the amounts of votes they'd got. And there are a lot of different ways you can do that. But I think quite a good way is to give every single voter a voucher, so when they go to vote, they can tick a box, whether it's, however much it is their allocation is, for which party they would like their share of the funding to go to. It might not be the same people that they were voting for. And that way, I think you could distribute it fairly with people actually deciding where the money went. But it would mean the taxpayer would have to pay, but it would be insignificant compared to,
we had
the
an academic on who said it would be 50 pence per person per year, which I think is about the same as we pay for the royal family. But can you imagine any political party going into a general election campaign telling the electorate you're going to pay for all of these posters that we're going to put up and all the leaflets that come through your door?
Well, I think you could do it, but it would take something like a citizens' jury, a big national discussion saying, look, this is what happens now. This is the corruption of our system. People are disgusted when they see, all of these billions of pounds that come from incredibly influential billionaires, mostly going to the Tories, and the Tories say that they're outraged by the unions paying for Labour. Either way, let's get money out of the system.
Andrea?
No, I just can't agree. I think democracy requires that people put the effort in, and actually what you'd soon find is that people didn't do any legwork anymore. Everything had to be posted and no one could be bothered. You'd lose the element of enthusiasm and just energy that people put into their politics if they're passionate about it. If it's all costed out and paid for by the taxpayer, yet again the taxpayer picks up the tab for something, it spreads and spreads, and I don't think it benefits anybody. I certainly think that the sums from any one organisation should be limited, but of course Labour don't support that because they get far bigger blocks from the trades unions than the Conservatives get from millionaires or business people. So arguably right. the block sums are
Can I ask you a question? You stood for the leadership of the Tory party. You had a leadership campaign which presumably took donations. You've been a cabinet minister. Over your years in Parliament, have you ever had anybody say to you, well, of course, if you sort of push this for me, I'll donate X amount either to your campaign or to the party?
No, never.
I think you can look at things like public health. Why is it we don't have proper salt, sugar taxes, things like that? Why is it so difficult to do? Because every time the great pushback from industry comes, why have they got so much influence? Partly it's sheer political weight, but it's also because they are big donors, very big donors to the Tory party.
I think that's completely false. I honestly think that is totally untrue. I've been around, as you point out, Ian, I've been around the cabinet table. I know the previous prime ministers, members of the cabinet, and I have never, in passing, in private chats or anything, ever come across anyone who says, do you know what, I need money from these people, so I'm not going to do
X
or Y.
When the chairman of the party says to a cabinet minister, I need you to go to this donors event, they just roll their eyes.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to do it.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's
they do. Huge, great Tory.
Well, they do. They
do.
do.
Events, yeah.
Well, I've been to one of those. They're not very fun.
Yeah, but they don't lead to anything, Ian. The reality is, as you know, as you just said, you go, you'll turn up and you'll talk and you can say, fine, you've got your 10 minutes with me. But I would agree with Andrew on this. I've never seen or heard of a minister who's gone, I did it because they were kind of putting some money in my pocket. It just doesn't work. And the idea that the public...
There was a certain question about Robert Jenrick, and he had to apologise for giving planning permission to Richard Desmond, who was a donor to the Tory party.
No, he was sat on he was sat on a table which he had no control over. He wasn't, that was a complete accident.
He did apologise because
he
apologised. This is the classic example of because of the dumping on his head by innuendo in the press. The fact of the matter is, Robert Jenrick cannot give someone planning permission. What on earth? You think Robert Jenrick sits there at the local council for whoever it is that he sat next to at dinner? Yes, but the point is, he signs off as Secretary of State, but the reality is, if it's a call-in decision, he has a whole planning inspection team who sit there and say the answer to the question is yes or no, sign here please. It's a very, very cold day when a Secretary of State says, actually, do you know what? I'm just going to go against all these reams of advice from this call-in. I mean, I even had somebody sign off something in my name as Secretary of State, and they weren't even me, and they apparently had the power to do so, and it was a decision with which I did not agree. So actually, to suggest...
I wouldn't have liked to have been that person the next day.
Ministers can overturn local planning decisions. They have the power to do that.
I agree with you, but I've just explained, Polly, exactly what happens if there is a call-in that is not the decision for the Secretary of State concerned. It's a decision that's taken on very detailed
quickly because we're running out of time, Mike.
Well, listen, I think I certainly have sympathy with the idea that you could, and certainly I think I'm right in saying that Labour came quite close to making proposals to introduce public funding of parties. I want to take a slightly different angle on this. And this is a very unpopular thing, I think, maybe to say, but I think actually where I'd like more public money directed is funding MPs and their support and select committees in Parliament, and actually having more resource going to that, because it isn't about Parliament, it isn't about party political activity, because I actually agree with the idea that you want to have people come forward and involve themselves in the political process. But at the same time, if you compare, we've been talking about America, how senators and representatives are resourced in Congress. It's light years away, the money. And if you...
Should they have higher salaries?
Well, if you pay... Well, we're not going to get...
That's a different subject.
It's not about the MP salaries, it's about the salaries of the people they employ and the expertise you get out of it. Because if you pay peanuts, then what do you get?
OK, well, we'll bring Andrew's assistant in to talk about this, who's outside.
I was just going to say, here with you there, Mike.
Well, look, there's no way that the public are going to start wanting to pay for political parties. The idea would just be laughed out. I mean, it's just not something we've ever done here. It's not something we would ever want to do.
That's not a good argument.
No, but it's not something we'd ever want to do here. Go and ask people, do you want to contribute money towards political parties? Their idea would be, no, political parties should inspire us to make donations in that sort of way. And I think we have to look at that. If you look at the way that money does get funneled through, it tends to follow when a party is inspiring, they get money from whatever source, and that I think you're seeing, on a constant basis. So we want inspiration, not the state doling.
On that note, I just observed that Labour's donations from individual donors is kind of off the charts compared with the Tories at the moment. So I think Keir Starmer must be doing a good job at inspiring some people.
Right. Final question from Sam in Cambridge. Joe Biden's aides were no doubt holding their breath during his visit to the UK today, fearing a gaffe. What's your worst head-in-hands moment in front of a watching public? Andrea.
Well, I have no regrets about this, but I would have to say withdrawing from the leadership race in 2016, because it was controversial and it was,
Which does indicate that you have regrets.
No, I don't have regrets. No,
Why was it a head-in-hands moment?
Head-in-hand because it was letting down a lot of people who'd put in, it was a very tough decision. So I have no regrets, but it's definitely the most kind of controversial thing I've done.
It was the best campaign. You had a team of people marching on Downing Street, demanding that you should be appointed.
Never mind. Alan.
Well, it must be the time that I unintentionally offended all of Ireland with a comment on a BBC show, which then led to 3 days of a fire hydrant of Twitter comments, which was...
Can I ask what you said?
It was to do with Brexit, and I said something along the lines of that we have to... of course, Brexit, of course. That that Ireland would need to be... I can't remember my exact words. You can look them up. But basically, it was that the Irish did not take kindly to being told how this was going to go down, basically. And they let me know about it afterwards.
Okay.
I think the video clip was watched by 1 million people, and given Ireland's population is 7 million, I think,
Mike.
Well, it's a nearly moment. I'm going to cheat a little. It's a nearly moment. So they asked me to be on the stage behind Keir Starmer when he did his leader speech at Labour conference last year.
You did a rabbit ears above.
Yeah, no, not quite. I didn't realise until the very last moment that I was actually going to be, literally behind his head for the whole of the speech. And I've got quite an active face. I thought, what happens if I sneeze, yawn, gurn? And I just spent the whole hour and a bit just concentrating, and I didn't actually take in much of it at all. So it was very nearly a head in hands moment, but I think I avoided it.
That's called being a donut.
Well, I've been called worse, Polly, so I'll take that.
Polly.
I think it was when I was BBC's social affairs editor, and I forgot the name of the minister I was interviewing. And I've now even forgotten who the minister was.
That is actually really difficult, isn't it? I've had that happen a few times where, in fact, I remember once when the producer didn't put the person's name or organisation on the screen, and I knew the subject we were talking about, but I had no clue who they were. And at the end I was thinking, well, how am I going to carry this off, saying, well, thank you, can't remember what happened now. Right, thank you.
So what's yours, Ian?
I think probably walking out of a live interview on Good Morning Britain. When I was being assailed from either side and not being allowed to say anything. And I think I was in a pretty bad mood anyway. And I just thought, sod this for a game of soldiers.
Yeah,
and
serves them right.
It's just as well you didn't fall over while you were at it, given your...
Note to Corey, never invite Polly Toynbee back on the programme. Which I don't mean, of course. Polly, thank you very much. Andrea, thank you. Mike and Alan, thank you very much too for being on the programme. Don't forget, tomorrow evening at 7, we have the 2 remaining candidates for London Mayor coming into the studio to take your calls. Hope you'll join us for that. Coming up in the next hour, I want to talk about the difficulties that ex-prisoners have in finding a job, because the government are pressing employers to train and hire ex-offenders in a drive to help prison leavers plug labour shortages and move into stable work when they complete their sentences. If you're an employer, do you actually make an effort to employ people who've been in prison? Or if you saw that somebody had been in prison on their CV, would you just automatically dismiss them? And if you have been in prison, how easy have you found it to find work when you leave? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.